I just want to read this card from Miss Karen. It says, Solid Rock Church family, Roger and I are so thankful that we call you our family. The love that you have shown us through phone calls, texts, and delicious food cannot be compared. We love each one of you and are thankful that God has placed us in Solid Rock, Roger and Karen. So appreciate all those that have helped them out and brought food over and done all the things that need to be done for them and for others as well. I love a good turn of phrase. Like, I collect them like other people would collect stamps or friends. That was a joke. I love a good turn of phrase. And I think you probably do too. You just don't love them as much as me because I just excel at that. Right? Is there a woman that was born in the southern U.S., maybe you haven't said this, Miss Linda, I don't know. You're from Iowa. That in the southeast part of the U.S. that has not at one point said, bless your heart, with a whole load of stuff piled on top of it. Is there anybody that said that? You ever said, Lord willing and the creek don't rise? Right? Lord willing. There's a lot to that one. I think my favorite one, I wish I could tell you some of my step-grandpas because he had some great ones, but I can't say any of those here in church. I'd have to take them to you in private. A lot of them have to do with church, too. I think my favorite one is all hat, no cattle, right? You ever use that one, all hat, no cattle? You ever heard that one? It's a fun one because there's a lot to it. It's a really polite way to say that somebody is all talk and no substance, right? They got the hat, they got the pearl snap shirt, they got the big truck, they got the boots, and they own 0 cows. They do everything they can to tell you that they're a cowboy, but there's nothing to back it up. They're all hat, no cattle. I love that one. It's just a lot to it, and you can use it without having cowboys involved at all, right? There's people that you work with that are all hat, no cattle, right? They show up at the meeting, they do all the talking, they suck up to the boss, and they offer absolutely nothing. You know people like that. And if the phrase, all hat, no cattle, had been a thing, and if cowboys had been a thing in first century Middle East, Jesus in Mark 11 would have used Jesus would have used the phrase, all hat, no cattle. Because that's exactly what he's talking about today in Mark chapter 11, where we're going to be at. I've talked to you, and we've got some people that haven't been with us before, so I'm just going to bore all the rest of you, reminding you that Mark is written in sandwiches, right? He starts off with an idea, he loads in a bunch of stuff about that idea, and then he caps up with that idea. And the idea that we're talking about here is about people who can see Jesus for who he is and respond that way, and people who can't see Jesus for who he is. We start off with the story of blind Bartimaeus, who is a guy sitting on the side of the road. Nobody thinks anything of him. Nobody offers him much consideration at all. But Jesus comes through town with a crowd. Jesus is not doing ministry. He's not healing people. He's not preaching. He's got his eyes firmly fixed on Jerusalem and the cross. He's going through town, and Bartimaeus cries out and says, Lord, help me. And everybody says, be quiet. But Jesus says, no. I'm going to stop what I'm doing. I'm going to deal with him. And he heals Bartimaeus, and Bartimaeus becomes a follower of Jesus from that point. And the juxtaposition that we're given is between two people. A guy that, despite all of his disadvantages, the fact that he could not tell you what color shirt you were wearing because he was blind, he could see Jesus better than any of the people that were there and could see. And we get these things that follow up with this idea of people that can see and people that can't see. The next one we look at, and Jesus kind of lays out a parade for people to go through. He lays out this parade that they're all going to go through town, and he has people steal a donkey, and they come back and they get permission in the middle of stealing the donkey, so it's not stealing anymore. He comes back and he takes a donkey, and these people that can see who he is, they sacrifice for Jesus. They lay down their most expensive piece of clothing on the road as an act of submission, and then they take the symbol of their nation, the palm leaf, and they lay it on the ground as an act of submission to fulfill the prophecy about Jesus entering town on a donkey, humble as a king coming in, not as one who's conquering, but as one who has a right to be there. And then he walks in, and there's all these people sacrificing and stealing livestock and doing the things they need to do to honor Jesus because they get who he is. And then he walks into the temple, and what happens? Nothing. He looks around. And the people that say that they can see who God is, the people that say they can worship, the people that say their whole business is about worship, the people at the heart of worship don't even recognize who Jesus is when he arrives. And so this next section, Mark is not going to juxtapose those two people for us anymore, but rather he's going to show us Jesus' response to people who claim to be able to see but can't understand any of it that he's doing, that claim to be the most religious among us, but respond as if nothing has happened when Jesus arrives. We're going to be in Mark chapter 11, starting in verse 12, with Jesus being very unfair to fruit trees. On Mark chapter 11, verse 12, on the following day when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. So what day is this? We've got Palm Sunday, right? We did Palm Sunday. The next day is Holy Monday. I don't know who made that up. It wasn't a Baptist that made up all those things, but we'll just call it Holy Monday, right? Holy Monday, Jesus has, on Palm Sunday, Jesus went to town. He went to the temple, had the parade, then he comes back where he's staying. The next day he goes back into town, and on the way into town, he was hungry. He didn't eat breakfast, so he wants something to eat. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Now, what do we have going on here? Jesus is walking at a time that it is not appropriate for fruit to be harvested. There's no reason to expect it to be harvested, but this tree gives all the signs that it has something to offer Jesus. And so he walks up to it and searches it and finds nothing and curses the tree. Now, you could just say, if you're looking at this just on its own, right, you're doing a 4-verse reading plan, you read through this and you think, well, Jesus is just a little hangry, he's a little grumpy, and so he overreacts to this tree. That's what you would think. But if you look at it in the context of what Mark is saying, he tells us something very different, right? That this isn't about the tree at all. It has nothing to do with the tree. That Jesus is laying the groundwork for the next thing that's about to happen. So what is this tree thing about? The tree advertises that it has what Jesus wants. It puts out all the leaves and says, everything you could possibly want from me, I'm available to you to offer. So Jesus goes to look for the thing that he wants from this tree that is advertised to everyone, I have what you want. And when he gets there, he finds absolutely nothing. This tree is all hat, no cattle. It's advertising itself as something that can be relied on, that can provide for Jesus, that can do what Jesus wants done. But when he looks, when he searches the leaves, he finds absolutely nothing. And what is his response to it? He curses the tree. We look at this and we look at it in the context of what's been happening and what's about to happen. We find out Jesus is not just grumpy. But Jesus has been showing us two different groups of people. The people that can see him, who have not pretended. Bartimaeus didn't pretend anything about himself. He sat on the side of the road begging. But whenever he encountered Jesus, he responded because he could see Jesus. But then you got all these other people that say they can see Jesus, that they say they understand God. They're at the temple worshiping, but when Jesus enters the room, they don't respond at all. And he says, I want you to understand what my reaction is going to be. You see this tree over here that says it has everything to offer me, that has everything I could possibly want? This tree is all hat, no cattle. And when I see that, my response is going to be to curse that. He's talking to us not about a tree, but about people. The kind of people we've been talking about. So who is it? Is he talking about the people that can see him or the people that can't see him? I think that's a pretty obvious thing to guess, but we don't have to guess because he keeps going. In verse 15, they came to Jerusalem. So on the way, Jesus curses a tree. The disciples are like, man, he was having a bad day. We come into the Jerusalem. He enters the temple. When was the last time he was in the temple? Yesterday, right? He was just there yesterday. This time there's no donkey, no procession. He walks in, and he walks into the place where people should have recognized the fulfillment of prophecy, should have recognized who he was, should have joined in the parade, but instead ignored him and went about their business. He walks into the temple and begins to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the temples of the money changers and seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. In case you are confused about who Jesus is talking about when he curses this tree, it's not the people throwing the parade. It's not the people laying down their coats. It's not the people offering up everything from their obedience to their possessions to Jesus. But it's the people that when he showed up had absolutely no response. It's the people that give off the show of religion but bear no fruit for him. And he walks in and he runs them out. Now, this is the second time that he's done this. He does this at the beginning of his ministry as well. If you look in John at the beginning of his ministry as he goes through, Jesus does this exact same thing. And then he caps off his ministry by doing it again. Don't panic, Cooper. I'm in the right spot. So don't panic back there. He does this at exactly the right moment. He does this twice. He does this at the first time, and then he does it again at exactly the right moment at the end of his ministry. So what does he do, though? Because you'll have people talk about, well, Jesus beat people with whips, and Jesus ran people out. There is no point where Jesus hit a person with a whip. That is not described at all. In fact, the whip isn't even in this part. What do we have Jesus doing? He enters the temple. He drives them out. Right? Maybe he had the whip, and Mark just doesn't tell us about it, but it doesn't say he hit the people with it. He drives them out. And then he flips over the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He doesn't destroy the livestock. He doesn't say it's not okay to sell these things. He doesn't say you shouldn't be doing this. He says what you're doing is not acceptable to do here and in the way that you're doing it. So I don't want to go off on a tangent. I don't want to do too much of a tangent, but I hear these things and I see these things about, well, when Jesus got upset, like he broke stuff, and so it's okay to break stuff. It's okay to loot. It's okay to do whatever. That's not what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is getting the people out of the place that he didn't want them to be, that God didn't want them to be. He ran them out. He flipped over the tables and did all this. So why is Jesus so upset about this? Well, you just have to understand, first of all, you have to understand what they're doing. So people would come in to sacrifice, right? And if you live in the area, it's not a big deal. You've got to bring an animal from your flock, so you bring an animal from your flock. You're within a day's journey. It's not that big of a deal. But if you're coming from farther away, herding livestock for several days is not a good plan, right? You've got the sheep that you're going to sacrifice. You've got whatever it is that you're going to sacrifice. You're already spending a lot of money on you're already spending a lot of money on the sacrifice and on the travel. So to get the sheep or get the whatever animal it is that you're bringing down there would be a pretty difficult thing to do. So what they would do is they would sell the livestock where they lived, and then they would bring the money down, and when they got there, they would buy an animal to sacrifice. Okay, that's not a problem. It's not a big deal at all. The problem was that they were charging exorbitant prices for these people to do that. So they would sell their sheep for whatever price back home, and then they would come back, and they would have to pay 150% of the value of the sheep. So they were either sacrificing less at the temple, because they had to sell a high-quality animal and buy a low-quality animal. Or they were having to just basically go into debt or use all their travel expenses that they had saved up to get back just to buy the sacrifice. They were robbing people, is what they were doing. There's also evidence that the Levites and the sellers had a deal going where what would happen is the Levites would always reject the sacrifice, say, this animal's not good enough. And then they would say, well, I've got a buddy over here, he's got a deal. He'll actually buy that low-quality animal from you and sell you a higher-quality one that's acceptable. So you would go to this dealer, you would sell this sheep, and then what do you know if he doesn't have one to sell you, but it costs 50% more than what you just sold it for? And the dude just puts the sheep in the back lot, and he sells it to the next person. And then the Levites would get a cut of it. They were robbing people who were coming to worship. The temple tax, they had set up this structure where you had to pay a temple tax, which was reasonable to maintain the temple. That was a reasonable thing that they did. But the way that they got you on that was you had to use temple currency. You couldn't use your drachma that you had from back home, your Greek currency. You had to use not the local currency, but the temple currency. So you would come from wherever you were, you had all your money. They would, I'm happy to exchange this for you. It's going to be a 50% exchange rate. And so they're robbing people, and again, either they have to give less to the temple, or they have to take so much from their traveling funds that they can barely afford to get back. So they had taken the worship of God and made it into an extortion scheme. And Jesus was very, very, very upset about this. Here's the other thing that's not obviously clear. It says that he entered the temple. Like, I don't know what's in your mind from the temple. When you think about the temple, what's in your mind? I don't know if you've had extra teaching on this, if it's just the flannel graphs for you, if it's something you saw on TV. But when it says they entered the temple, he wasn't actually inside the temple. He was in the court of the Gentiles. Go ahead and pull that picture up, Cooper. I don't know how well you can see this. But the temple is basically divided into 4 sections, okay? This left intersection is right here over on the side. This is called the holy place and the court of the priest. Only the priests were allowed to go there, okay? They took pretty good care of that. The part there in the middle where that little blue square is, that's the men's court. The men could go in there, women couldn't go in there, but it has to be Jewish men. On the right side, the court of the women, everybody could come through there. All the Jewish people could come through there, but only the Jewish women had to stay right there. They couldn't go anywhere else. So if you notice this is all fixated on Jews. You've got the priests, you've got the Jewish men, you've got the Jewish women. But all the stuff around the outside for a ways outside of the temple was called the court of the Gentiles, the Gentile court. And Mark doesn't say which part of the temple that Jesus was in, but what Josephus, who was a historian at the time, told us is there was a big practice of sellers setting up in the court of the Gentiles. Whenever Jesus, in this next verse that we're going to look at, don't go to it yet, when he gets to this next verse that we're going to look at, he says this is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. So where were they set up at? They were set up in the court of the Gentiles. Okay, why is that significant? Why does that matter? The point of choosing a people for his own was not to make those people more special than everybody else, not to make those people better than everybody else, but to be an example to the entire world of what God wanted to have with everyone. Right? God did not do this quietly. Whenever he took them out of Egypt, there are 10 massive plagues in the most powerful nation in the world. Do you think he did that because he wanted to keep it a secret? He did that specifically so that the world would find out what he had done. And whenever they cross through the promised land, they go in, the first place they go to is Jericho. The kids are in this section in their classes right now. They're right in that point where they're going into Jericho. What is it that Rahab says? Like, we have heard everything that your God has done to bring you to this point. We have heard about this stuff. God was not doing this to make it quiet, but he did this to make a point to the entire world that he was the true God of the universe, that he was the one that should be worshiped, and he even made a method for people who wanted to also be part of his chosen people to become part of his chosen people. Rahab, who was in the line of Jesus, was not a Jew, but became a Jew because of what God had done. Ruth was not a Jew, also in the line of Jesus, was not a Jew, but entered into the family of Abraham because of the work of God and what she had seen there. You go through and you see these people that are not Jews that become Jews, and that was God's intent for the entire world. Not necessarily for them to become Jews, but for them to recognize who the true God was. And he even, when he had them design the temple, when he laid out the temple, he had them create a place that the entire world could gather. You know what? You're not a Jew, you're a Jewish man, you can't go in this spot. You're not a priest, you can't go in this spot. You're not a Jewish woman, you can't go in this spot. But if you're a Gentile, you can still approach the temple and worship. Why was Jesus so upset, other than them just stealing from people who had come to worship? Where had they set up at? They had turned the court of the Gentiles, the place that was set aside so that all those who did not know God already might come and find him and worship. They had turned that into an airport kiosk. Overpriced flea market products they had set up in the place that was set aside for the worship of the nations. What does this say? What does it say? It says what we care about is us. What we care about is those who already know God. What we care about is our people. Because the booths weren't set up in the men's court, they kept that special. The booths weren't set up in the women's court, they kept that special. Where were the booths set up? In the place that those who were far from God would have an opportunity to come near to God. They had set that up because what did they care about? They cared about themselves. They cared about the people of Abraham. They did not care about anybody else that came through. You know how you can tell what we care about? You can tell what we care about by what spaces we take care of and what spaces we don't take care of. Where do we decide, like, you know what, this can be stored here because this spot doesn't matter? You can tell what we care about by where we stick things. In your house, where do you store things in your house? You've got that extra bedroom that you don't go into, that you don't sleep in, so you stick stuff in there. Why? Because it doesn't matter. right? If somebody comes over, you'll clean it out for them. Our stuff is piled up in the attic, and it's just up there. Why? Why do we not care about that space? Because it's not something that matters to us. And by setting up all these vendors in the court of the Gentiles, the place that was set aside for the nations to come and know God and worship Him, what did they say? What we care about is ourselves. What we care about is those who already know God. What we care about is those who are part of our little club. And we really don't care whether those other people come to know Him or not. In fact, we care about it so little, we're going to rent that space out so that it can be used to make some money. Jesus is angry because they're taking advantage of worshipers, but He's also angry because their job was to let the entire world know that Yahweh was the one true God. And instead, they had focused on telling each other that Yahweh was the one true God, and to hell, literally, with the rest of the world. And Jesus was angry. Why? Because they put on a show of righteousness. They put on a show of worship. Their tree was full of leaves advertising to the world, we are the ones with the fruit. But when Jesus went in the day before to inspect that tree, what did He find? A group of people that didn't even notice that He'd entered. That's what He found. And Jesus didn't just flip tables over, but He began to teach them. In verse 17, He was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations?" It's not just supposed to be a house of prayer for you. It's not just supposed to be a place of ministry for you. It's not just supposed to be a place of ministry for those that already believe. It's not supposed to be a place of ministry just for those who are already part of this specific group. But it's supposed to be a light to the entire world. And the only place that they have to worship, the only place that they have to approach me, the only place you have filled up with overpriced animals and exorbitant exchange rates, you have made it a den of robbers. Why did Jesus do this? He does it at the beginning of His ministry. Why does He do it right now? Like, what's going on here? Well, I think He does it on purpose. Obviously, He does it on purpose, but I think He does it strategically at this moment. Because at this moment, their response to this is, in verse 18, the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy Him, for they feared Him, because all the crowd was astonished at His teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. They wanted to kill Him, exactly as He intended. He arranged things and spoke to them in such a way so that it was really, really clear to them what He was saying, so that they would be worked up to the point that they would want to kill Him. If anybody ever tells you that Jesus didn't intend to go to the cross or that people murdered Him because He was nice, they're wrong. Jesus arranged this and even made people angry. I've got some of my step-grandfather's euphemisms I could use here. I'll choose not to do that. He did some things to make them angry so that they would want to destroy Him. And He did it on purpose at this moment. So what are we supposed to do with this? Right? Does this mean the point of this is don't have high schoolers fundraisers in the lobby of the church? Is that what the point of this is? Right? Don't sell T-shirts at church. That's what this is for. Is that the point of this? There's definitely an application there, but I think that we limit this teaching pretty distinctly whenever we limit it to, well, we can't sell anything at church. We'll have to go out in the parking lot to do that. His point was not about buying and selling. Because you want to know something? The people needed to buy stuff. These people that traveled from other places, they needed to buy sheep. They needed to exchange their currency. That's not the issue. The issue is where they chose to do it and the way that they chose to do it. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I really think this would have gone very differently if they'd said, you know what, we're going to set up in one area over here so that we can make this okay, and it's going to be right outside the temple where people can still get to it. We're going to charge a small fee for this because we need to live, but we want to make sure that it's possible. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think Jesus would have a problem. I don't know for sure, but I don't think he would. I think the bigger problem is that they were taking advantage of people who were there to worship and that they had forgotten their purpose. Their purpose was to be a light to the world, to produce fruit in the world. And instead, they had focused on making it look like they had a lot of fruit. They had focused instead on producing as many leaves as possible. So when everyone looked at them, they would think, wow, that tree must produce a lot of fruit. And so we look at this and we say, what is his point here? I think the point is for us to ask ourselves a question. We've asked ourselves this question last week. I asked you as we looked at the response of the people that could see Jesus clearly, right? The people that could see Jesus clearly, they obeyed him. They worshiped him, not just singing songs, but they sacrificed in order to worship him. They submitted themselves to him in whatever way. And the people that didn't see him did absolutely nothing. And I asked you a question last week, which one are you? Don't tell me which one you think you are. Don't tell me which one you want to be. Don't tell me which one you've always told yourself you are, but look at your actions, your obedience, your worship, your sacrifice, your submission, and tell me which one you are. And this week, I want to ask you to ask yourself this question. Okay, I'm considering which one I am. Am I the one that can see Jesus clearly for who he is, or am I not? And I just want to ask you this question. What fruit have you produced? What fruit have you produced? Well, I go to church and I give and I've got lots of leaves. I blow in the wind. Makes a nice rustling sound. But what fruit have you produced? Because the production of fruit is the thing that indicates what's going on inside of you. And if all you produce are leaves that show everybody else how religious you are, but there is no fruit produced for the work of Jesus, then this is for you. People who make a show of religion, who show up at the temple, but who have forgotten that their purpose is to be a light to the entire world so that many may come to know him. What fruit have you produced? Well, I don't know what you mean by fruit. Well, let's go through some things because some fruit can mean a lot of things, right? Let's ask about some basic, easy fruit. Have you grown at all? And I'm not talking about needing new shirts. Have you grown spiritually at all? Or are you the exact same person that you've been for the last 10 years, the last 20 years? Have you grown? Do you trust him more than you did before? Do you understand him more than you did before? Do you talk to him and about him more than you did before? This is the easiest fruit you can possibly have. We're not even getting to the point about you sharing the gospel. Have you grown? Has anyone come to know Jesus through you? Jesus was upset because they were in the court of the Gentiles, the place that people who didn't know God were supposed to have the opportunity to know God, and they had just decided that they were going to sit out that part of their responsibility. Have you done the same thing? Has anyone come to know Jesus through you? Have you even tried to share the gospel with somebody that they might come to know Jesus through you? Pick something else. Pick a fruit. We can talk about the spiritual. We can talk about spiritual growth, the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. We can talk about your own personal development. We can talk about your level of service. Make up a fruit and tell me if you've produced it. Because if not, then this is for you. Because Jesus started, before he went to the temple, he went to this fig tree, and he said, this fig tree tells me it has everything I could possibly want. This fig tree tells me. But when I look for something more than just talk, I find nothing. Have you produced fruit? Because regardless of how well you think you see Jesus, if no fruit is being produced in you, you have a problem. We look at this, and it's really easy to think of this as an angry God kind of thing, because Jesus is a little irritated in this, right? Like, produce fruit now, produce fruit. I'm so mad at you. Why won't you produce fruit? What's wrong with you that you won't produce fruit? Very powerful. But I want you to think about it a little bit differently. So my grandmother, if you're friends with Miss Rita on Facebook, watching her iris pictures, she's got these beautiful double-bearded irises. Are they double-bearded or just, they're double-bearded? They're bearded irises and beautiful flowers. And my grandmother, that was her thing, was irises. And so she would order from every catalog she could find. She would see irises of different colors on the side of the road, and she would stop and ask to dig up some bulbs. And she collected the biggest collection of irises that she could possibly have. And they had a big stretch of the road was on their front yard. They had a wide yard. It was 150 feet, something like that. I'm not good with numbers, so I'm just guessing. But it was a big, long flower bed that she had filled with every possible color of iris. And I decided, she died 10 years ago, something like that, probably 14 years ago. And I said, I think this is something I want of hers. I want her irises. And so I went to my dad's, he lives in their house now. And I went out, and it was winter, and I couldn't tell what kind of irises I was digging up. So I just went to random spots throughout her flower beds and dug up irises because I wanted to plant these in my yard, be able to look at those irises and think of her. That's what I wanted. And I planted those 3 years ago. This is our third summer. So I planted them spring 3 years ago. And you know, the first year they didn't bloom. And I was disappointed, but it was reasonable, right? I just planted them that spring. They take a little time to grow. So I was like, okay, first summer, next year. So I get to the next summer. And they put off all these leaves. I don't even know what they're called. The irises have these weird leaf stick, hard, I don't know what they are, but we'll call them leaves. They put up all these leaves, and there were no blooms. I thought, okay, it's fine. It's fine. It's been two years. They take a little time to grow. I texted Miss Rita, I think. And I was like, what's going on? And she's like, well, if you bury them too deep, and sometimes they take a little while. I'm like, okay. It's the third summer. I'm so excited to see these irises because I want to know what we planted. I want to know which of her irises I got. And I went out there, and it became a thing in the family. Like we finally got one bloom. And it's a beautiful bloom. It's white, and it's got yellow on the inside. It's beautiful. But I've waited 3 years, and I did not wait 3 years for one bloom. It finally put off 2 more, which is good. 3 is more than 1. But I have this whole row of leaves. I've got 5 plants that are sitting there. And you know what they keep telling me? It's not the season for irises. We need a couple more years. And weed around these stupid things and make sure they get enough water and take care of them. And I'm frustrated with my irises, but I'm not angry with my irises because what I want for them is not for them to do work for me. I want to celebrate them. I want to look at them in love as they remind me of my grandmother. I want to look at these things and be proud of them. And the fact that they refuse to produce fruit is frustrating. Not because I'm mean, but because I love them. And I love her. And I want to see them be something more than just leaves with the promised potential of fruit when things slow down. You know, the kids are pretty young right now. It's really hard when they get older. I'm so busy at work whenever whenever things slow down at work, when I retire, I'm going to be a ministry machine. You better believe it. You know, we're in the middle of something right now, and I can't really do it, but there's going to come a point. We look at this and we think, okay, God is being mean because, like, where's the fruit? What's happening? I'm going to curse you if there's no fruit. But why does he want you to produce fruit? It's because he loves you. And you were made to produce fruit. And he wants you to produce fruit to celebrate what's happening in you. And we keep making excuses. But what was Jesus' response to the tree that said, it's not the season for figs? His response was, you told me. You told me. By the way you displayed yourself that you were one of the best. That you had what I wanted. You told me by everything else. You didn't say, hey, this is the season for growth. I'm still young and immature in this. You said you had what I wanted. And when I came to you to inspect you, you said, well, it's not the season for figs. It's a difficult time. It's not a good time for me right now. I'm definitely going to get back to it later. And what was Jesus' response? He cursed the fig tree. He cursed the fig tree. It's unreasonable to curse a tree. I think it's unreasonable to curse a tree. I mean, Jesus does what he wants to. He can do whatever he wants to. I don't think the point was about cursing the tree. I don't think the question about the season for figs was for the tree. But it was for those of us to say, you know what, I'll produce fruit when the season is right. I'll grow when I have more time. I'll share the gospel when I have more time. I'll serve when I have more time. I'll produce fruit when the season is right. So, are you the one he's talking to today? Are you the one he's talking to today? You might not be. If you have never trusted Jesus, if you look at yourself and you've still been trying to do this on your own and all you're putting out is leaves, nothing real is happening because you're trying to rescue yourself, you're trying to be enough on your own, here's what I need you to understand. You are a sinner. You are going to die for your sin. You are going to go to hell because of your sin. Not because you're worse than me, but because you're just like me. And unless someone else dies in your place, you are going to hell. But Jesus offered up his own life so that you might trust in him to receive that. So the standard will no longer be, am I good enough to go to heaven, but have I trusted in Jesus to take me to heaven? And if you've not done that yet, this message is not for you. It's not about you trying harder. It's not about you doing more. It's about you giving up on trying to do it on your own and trusting in him. If you are producing fruit, I ain't mad at you. This sermon was not written for you. I didn't look at you and say, they should produce more fruit. If you are producing fruit, this is not for you. Good job. Keep going. But if when I ask you the question and even give you the opportunity to make up your own kind of fruit to see if you've produced it, you have produced no fruit, this message is for you. And here's the thing. The way that I preach, you know how I preach? I go through and I just start at the beginning and go to the end. And I trust that whatever it is that I preach about that day is for the people that are there to hear it. And so what I know is that though I'm not mad at you and I don't know whether you produce fruit or not, Jesus does know whether you produce fruit or not. And he knew you were going to be here today to hear this message. And the Holy Spirit is convicting you and telling you exactly what's wrong and what you need to do about it. The question is, how will you respond? The question is, how will you respond? How did the people at the temple respond? They got angry, right? They got angry and decided to kill Jesus. Are you angry when I ask you if you've produced fruit? Are you angry when I ask you what you've done for Jesus lately? And if you are, does it trouble you that your response is the same response that the people who tried to kill Jesus had? But if instead your response is humility, it's submission, then you're exactly where you need to be. So deal with it today. Would you stand with me? Our Heavenly Father, we come before you right now, and I thank you so much for the fact that you've given us this chance to gather together and worship. And that you give us your word. You're not leaving us out there to figure it out on our own or trust the opinion of what somebody else has to say about you, but that you have given us your word so that we might look to it and know who you are and what you want to do. I ask that as we consider what it is that you've tried to say to us today, Lord, that your Spirit would speak to us, that it would apply it to us, and that we might respond in the way that you would have us to, Lord. Make us into an orchard, but not an orchard of trees full of leaves that make a nice sound when the wind blows, but produce fruit in us, Lord. Allow us to submit and trust you that we might produce fruit. And if there's any here today, Lord, that does not know you, that's trying to produce fruit on their own, that's trying to make it happen on their own rather than submitting to and trusting in you, I ask that today they would recognize that they cannot do that on their own, and that they might cry out to you for rescue and salvation today. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.